I can't help thinking that the story of David would make a wonderful movie trilogy. I have seen a few attempted movies on David's life, but I must confess to have been rather underwhelmed by them. But what a magnificent story this is, just as a story. In part one, we saw the emergence of the young king, God's chosen leader. We saw his training and progress towards the throne against the backdrop of a nation that was slowly slipping into the darkness of unbelief. And then in part two, we witnessed the early golden age of his reign. And then the beginnings, the sad decline that stemmed from David's self-indulgence, his personal sin, his failure to act justly, which created the circumstances in which David's son Absalom was able to win over the hearts of the people and lead a rebellion against his father and lay claim to the crown. David then, as we saw last time, had to flee with his loyal followers. David's key advisor, Ahithophel, joined Absalom's rebellion. David's men are now on the run, weak, vulnerable, all seems lost. But the story isn't over. We're still waiting for the return of the king, dare I say it. And his fate, humanly speaking, now is in the hands not of Frodo Baggins, a hobbit, but an Archite called Hushai, who has been entrusted with the dangerous mission of infiltrating Absalom's high command, subverting the advice that Ahithophel gives, and acting as David's spy, David's eyes and ears, smuggling out any information he gains by means of a small network of spies. Now, Hushai wasn't physically prepared for this. In fact, when David gave him this challenge, he was in mourning. He had dust all over his head. His robe was torn. So we have to imagine him hastily cleaning up, grabbing fresh clothes that would give the impression of the executive ready to do business, to go into court, to be an advisor for Absalom, heading down the Mount of Olives, trying to control his emotions of fear and anxiety, while all the time thinking through precisely how he was going to gain Absalom's confidence, and in particular, what he would say in the first crucial encounter. And that's where we come into the story today in 2 Samuel 16, verse 16. It was a dangerous, critical moment. So much was hanging by these opening words. Then Hushai the Archite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said to him, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" And Absalom said to Hushai, "So, this is the love you show your friend," referring, of course, to David. "If he's your friend, why didn't you go with him?" And Hushai said to Absalom, "No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people and by all the men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you." Now, I encourage you to read those words very carefully when you get an opportunity, because they're chosen very precisely. Are they deception, lies, cunning? I'll leave that to you to decide. Long live the king. But which king? Whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain. But who had the Lord chosen? Hushai didn't say. Who had all the people chosen? The jury was still out. Whom should I serve? Should it not be a son? As I have served your father, so I will serve you. but serve you how? As he had served his father, David, i.e. with total loyalty to David. Was he going to serve Absalom still in total loyalty to David? The interesting thing, whatever you make of his words, is that Absalom's name isn't mentioned once. What would Absalom decide? I can just imagine the tense pause at this moment. Hushai's heart in his mouth. And then suddenly Absalom moves on. Time was of the essence. What should his next move be? So he turned to Ahithophel for advice. Now, Ahithophel, the brilliant advisor, his first piece of advice was this, that Absalom should publicly take over King David's harem of concubines. Now, that may be quite a shock, and it certainly would have been a shock to the people at the time. It was the custom in the ancient world that if a king defeated another king, he took over the king's harem. So by doing this, Absalom would be acting as if he had already won. That was clever on the part of Ahithophel. But there was another reason. Absalom was David's son, not some foreign conqueror. So for Absalom to sleep with his father's concubines, that would have been such a shocking thing in the eyes of the people that they would immediately realize that reconciliation was completely out of the question. People would no longer be able to sit on the fence as to which side they were on. Absalom was, if you like, burning all bridges. And people therefore had to commit themselves. It was a bold, clever strategy on the part of Ahithophel to make clear from the very beginning that no compromise was possible. There could be no lingering hopes of peace talks. People had to choose one side or the other. And Absalom did what Ahithophel advised without asking Hushai for his opinion, perhaps because it appealed to his own image of himself as the true macho man and to prove his manliness. The second piece of advice in 2 Samuel 17 now was equally decisive and brutal and brilliant. Ahithophel would take a sizable force of soldiers, pursue David that very night, find him, and kill him. The reasoning was simple. David was on the run. He was tired. He was demoralized. The sudden sight and sound of a pursuing army would strike fear into David's men, cause them to flee. But Ahithophel's plan was only to kill David. So that when David's followers realized that Absalom wasn't against them, but only against David, once David was dead, chances were they would swing over to Absalom's side and the nation would be at peace. David was the key. Remove him and Absalom would be king. And again, this advice seemed good to Absalom and his other advisors. We might want to pause at the moment and ask, well, what had happened to Absalom's claim that he was running on a mandate for justice? Here's a man who would run a sword through his own father's heart without conscience. If he would do that to his own father, what would he not do to anyone else? Again, a little reminder that those who cry loudest for justice, sadly, once they get into power, suddenly can go very quiet on the issue that helped get them elected. Is this the kind of leader you would go for? Remember, we're still back in this question of where would your loyalty have gone? Well, this was a big decision. So much was at stake, and Absalom critically decided to get a second opinion. So he turned to Hushai. Hushai's moment had come. So let's read 2 Samuel 17, verse 7. Hushai replied to Absalom, "The advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. You know your father and his men. They are fighters and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Beside, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now he's hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, 'There has been a slaughter amongst the troops who follow Absalom.' Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear, for all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found. We will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not so much as a pebble is left." Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel." Well, certainly speech was better, even though my acting prowess isn't quite Viggo Mortensen, but you can imagine what would happen when that speech is in their right mouth. Wow. For the Lord, the writer adds, had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Hushai's not good was a calculated risk. To call anything Ahithophel advised not good would have been a shock, but at least he got their attention. And then his follow-up on this occasion, an acknowledgement that, of course, Ahithophel normally is brilliant, but actually he's got things terribly wrong. And now, well, we have heard it, Hushai paints a very different picture, using dramatic language, calling upon vivid imagery that appeal to the imagination. David and his mighty men were mighty warriors, skilled, experienced, as Absalom well knew. What more, they were now enraged. Like a bear deprived of its cubs, they would fight to the death. And of course, David knew all about caves and fighting in the hill country. He had done it before. The stories were legendary. Absalom would have been brought up on these stories of how David in his youth had outwitted Saul and his great army. And then what will happen when David fights back, as he will? He's a cunning warrior. And when the body bags start to mount up and the press get a hold of it, and reports that Absalom's troops are being routed, that will be a disaster. No, there is a much better strategy that will lead to total victory. Get the entire army to you. And you, Absalom, lead them in person, not Ahithophel, you. And attack in numbers, with you leading the charge. That way, we will wipe out not only David, but all who follow him. Get rid of the entire opposition at one swift stroke. And if David and his men try to take refuge in the city, we will bring huge ropes and put them around the city and pull the whole thing apart. Wow. You just picture it, the appeal to Absalom's imagination and to his vanity. He could just see himself, the head of this vast army, bringing wrath down on David and his men, sweeping away all remnants of his kingdom, pulling the city with ropes into the valley. What a sight that would be. Absalom was sold. But the delay that this strategy involved was fatal. gave Hushai the chance to get the word out to David through a spy network. David was able to get across the Jordan River, regroup his troops. By rejecting Ahithophel's good counsel, Absalom sealed his own fate, and Ahithophel saw it. And when he discovered that his advice had not been taken, he simply went home, put his house in order, and ended his own life. Because he knew what would happen, and that his own life would be forfeit, and he wasn't going to wait for it. The question then is, why did Absalom reject Ahithophel's advice? What are we meant to take from this story? Why is so much time given to it? Well, it seems to me that there are two major considerations. The first we need to be reminded of, and the writer steps into the story to remind us. He doesn't often do this, but he does it here. To remind us that the dimension of human action and decision making is not the only dimension to life. And it's something that we all need to be reminded of, I think, from time to time. The Lord had ordained to defeat Ahithophel's good counsel. See, David was God's chosen king, not Absalom. Absalom's rebellion was not simply against his own father, it was against God himself, and God was working out his purposes. And as the great Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar would discover later in history, the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. All rebellions against God will ultimately come to nothing. God's purposes in human history will be fulfilled. That's lesson number one, the sovereignty of God, God fulfilling his purposes. But that doesn't mean that God made Absalom follow Hushai's advice, that Absalom was merely a puppet, thinking, deciding, and acting without choice, and therefore not morally responsible for his own actions. He was responsible. At this human level, what made Absalom follow Hushai's advice was his own vanity and pride. The scenario that Hushai painted appealed to his ego. We had a hint of this in the early incident regarding Absalom's magnificent hair and how he carefully curated his public image. Absalom wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in himself, in how he was seen, in his image, his success, his power. It was his vanity and pride that proved his undoing. God was not responsible for Absalom's sin. Absalom was. So you have these two great themes that are taught throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament. God's sovereignty, fulfilling his purposes in human history. Human responsibility. Both are taught in this story and throughout Scripture, and therefore we need to do our best to hold on to both without expecting to be able to reconcile them both in our minds, philosophically or theologically, because they go, by definition, beyond us. When Paul discusses this kind of thing in Romans 9, 10, and 11, he ends the discussion by saying, God's ways are beyond finding out. So don't claim, please, to have found them out. Because if you do claim, you're bound to be wrong. They are beyond finding out. But there is magnificent rest and assurance here. And we all need it. Because life doesn't always go smoothly. Either our own lives, or the life of the nation around us, or the nations around us. And as we look either at our own life or the world around us, or at both, we can so easily be shaken. But God's kingdom cannot be shaken. We need the vision that John has given in Revelation of Jesus, who is the ruler of the kings of the earth. We need to understand what Nebuchadnezzar came to understand, that God rules in the affairs of man. And find our trust and our assurance not in things working out the way we want them, but rather in things working out to the purposes of God. There is rest and peace and assurance here. But at the same time, we have to live and act in this world. And at this human level, there is, it seems, a very powerful lesson about human pride and arrogance. This is a sad story. We're given very little detail about the battle itself. The focus is first on Absalom's fate and on David's response to it. David's commanders refused to allow David to lead them because David's the target. So David had to entrust the fighting to his commanders, Joab and the others. As he did so, he gave repeated instructions. Watch out for Absalom. Try and make sure that no harm comes to him. You see the way he's caught. It's his son. And in the heat of the battle, Absalom got separated from his men riding through the woods. His lush, long hair gets entangled in some branches, parting him from his horse, leaving him dangling helplessly, trapped. And it's reported by those who see him to Joab. David's soldiers who spot him obey David's instruction not to harm him, but Joab, he went immediately to the spot and ran Absalom through with a sword and left it to his soldiers to finish the job. It is a sad and sordid end. Trapped by his own hair in his rebellion against the rightful king. Trapped by that carefully curated symbol of his own vanity. His so-called vow to the Lord had proved to be a sham. His claim to be interested in providing justice for all was a sham. Absalom was all about Absalom. But none of us is big enough to fill our own lives. Perhaps we need to think about that. Because we are being surrounded all the time, constantly, by the kind of psycho-babble that has been adopted by just about every media voice. It's all about you. It's all about your journey. It's all about you being yourself and you fulfilling yourself and you in this I world. But we weren't designed for that. I'm not big enough to fill my own life. You're not big enough to fill your own life. This is not to criticize you or undermine you or devalue you. It's to get you in the right place. You were designed to find your fulfillment outside yourself in something far bigger than yourself. How foolish would it be if you're in a boat in a stormy sea, tossed around everywhere, you find an anchor, you decide, oh, wonderful, we've got an anchor, let's just put it in the boat. It's got to be in something solid outside you. And Absalom made himself the goal and substance of his own life and perished a reduced shell of a human being, a corpse hanging between heaven and earth. But when we read the news of Absalom's death being brought to David, that's where our focus finally goes today. The king was shattered. We read in 2 Samuel 18, verse 33, the king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." The cries of a father's broken heart. It's very poignant. A father's grief over his lost child resonates with so many. If only it could have been me and not him, not her. Couldn't I have done something else, something different? Parenting isn't for cowards, is it? Having to come to terms with the fact that one day this little child that you pour your love into will have to make up his or her own mind about how to live and what to believe, will have to make his or her own mistakes, will be responsible for his or her own action. And if your child rebels, totally turns against what you have sought to teach and nurture, wrecks their life and others, then comes the agonizing questioning. Where did I go wrong? If only I had done this, if only I had done that differently. And of course, David didn't have very far to look to find faults in his own life. His self-indulgence, his passivity, his struggle to reconcile love and justice in his own family, unwilling to let his children that he loved face discipline, surrounding them with sentimentality and moral confusion. And yet, Absalom's choices were his own. His actions were his own. We will never be able to solve this puzzle as parents. Where did I go wrong? What could I have done differently? Because there's no straight line here. There's no magic formula. There are no perfect leaders. There are no perfect church elders. There are no perfect parents. 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4 when it comes to parenting. That doesn't mean we give up. We do our best. But in the end, we have to trust the Lord and commit our pain, our tears, our fears to Him, knowing that in the end, God's purposes will be fulfilled. What a test of David's leadership. He was so defeated in himself that he nearly allowed him the significant victory his troops had won to be turned into defeat. He continued lamenting. He risked devaluing and alienating his loyal followers who had risked their lives for him. And Joab had to go in and see him and do some very straight talking. You have made it clear today, David, that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead, then you would be pleased. That's some straight talking. And he appealed to him. Act like a king. Take your place in the gate of the city. Speak to the hearts of those people who have fought so loyally for you. Managing private grief when in a position of leadership in church and society and the home is one of the hardest challenges of life. You can't afford to indulge your feelings too long, can you? Or allow private grief and pain to damage those around you. And in the midst of his grief, David managed to recover his composure and exercise leadership and put the steps together that would bring the nation back into unified whole. So as we finish, our question is still there. Which leader gets your vote? The man who would kill his father without compunction if it served his purposes? Or the man who wished he had died instead of a son? If the positions had been reversed, I can't see Absalom breaking his heart over the death of his father, can't you? It's not a choice between perfect and imperfect. But for me, in the end, there's one clear winner who attracts my heart, but perhaps that's too easy. We know the outcome. It's a long time ago and far away. Let me paint another scenario for you as we finish. The New Testament warns of a massive rebellion still to take place against God and against the Lord Jesus Christ, a truly spectacular leader who will rise as the ultimate Antichrist, and he will claim to be interested in establishing peace and justice. He will have amazing PR. He will have a voice and a face for television. He will ooze confidence and competence. It will seem that this spectacular human being, in this person at last, humanity has come of age, and we don't need to look outside ourselves anymore for salvation. Human genius in the form of this great leader will solve world conflict, world hunger, the economic and social problems that threaten to tear the world apart. And if you are alive when that happens, what would you choose? This great leader, or a rejected Jesus followed by a few despised people who are seen as the scum of the earth and the cause of all the problems? On what basis would you make your choice? The issue is even more immediate, for the spirit of Antichrist is very much alive. One of the great mistakes over the years has been to depict the evil one as a hideous, ugly monster. His name is Lucifer, the bearer of light. According to Ezekiel 28, perfect in beauty. And how many have been ensnared not by the ugliness but by the beauty into rebelling against God? So much that's beautiful and lovely and wonderful to be enjoyed in life, the art, the music, the sport, the sex, the just being alive. And God is painted as the one who is somehow anti-life, even though he created it all. And the only way that we can get a life and enjoy these things is by removing God from the picture. Are you listening to those voices? Am I? It's not just in your teenage years that you hear those voices, but in young adulthood and in old adulthood. And the pressure is intense. The key tactic is to use the good things, the lovely things, the beautiful things to entice our hearts away from our loyalty to Christ. What will keep you loyal to him? Let's pray. Father, thank you again for this magnificent story. It's sobering, it's challenging, it speaks to all our hearts. May we bow before it and learn from it. Take the warnings, take the encouragement, trust in your sovereignty, but don't trust in human pride and arrogance, and seek in every way to remain loyal to the rejected and despised Jesus, knowing that one day he will come. The King will return. We thank you in his name. Amen.